MTC. Light, 2022, P11 No Exercise 1. The problem is not that using social media directly makes us unhappy. Indeed, as the positive studies found, certain social media activities, when isolated in an experiment, modestly boost well-being. The key issue is that using social media tends to take people away from the real-world socializing that's massively more valuable. As the negative studies imply, the more you use social media, the less time you tend to devote to offline interaction, and therefore the worse this value deficit becomes, leaving the heaviest social media users much more likely to be lonely and miserable. The small boosts you receive from posting on a friend's wall or liking their latest Instagram photo can't come close to compensating for the large loss experienced by no longer spending real-world time with that same friend. As Shakya summarizes, where we want to be cautious, is when the sound of a voice or a cup of coffee with a friend is replaced with likes on a post. Shakya. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Light, 2022, P11 No Exercise 2. It turns out that we tend to have more doubt about the truth of the facts described by speakers with a foreign accent compared to native speakers. For example, if we are asked to judge whether we believe the content is real in the phrase "ants do not sleep," we believe it to be more true when someone with a native accent says it rather than someone with a foreign accent. In addition, it seems that when we interact with a person who has a foreign accent, we tend to process language somewhat differently than with native people. In some ways, and maybe due to certain problems with understanding, we pay less attention to the details of speech and look more at the communicative intent. It's a bit like we do not care what the person says, but what they really mean. And that is why our memory of the exact words that people use in a conversation is much more accurate when people speak with a native accent. So when you speak in a foreign language, don't expect people to remember exactly what you said or the details of your message. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Light, 2022, P11 No Exercise 3. Driven by Enlightenment ideals, exploration gradually evolved from the wholesale plunder of foreign lands in search of gold to more virtuous scientific purposes. Instead of conquerors, explorers were now botanists, physicists, astronomers, and anthropologists. It was no longer enough to merely find the world, exploration now meant truly discovering it. Curiosity had always been an exploratory motive, but an international competition for prestige based on scientific discovery was something new. Even the ships were intended to reflect the new ideals under which they sailed, with names such as Discovery, Resolution, Endeavor, Adventure, Geography, Naturalist, and Astrolabe. Discovery, Resolution, Endeavor, Adventure, Geography, Naturalist, Astrolabe. Some ventures, such as the French 1735 mission to Ecuador to measure the shape of Earth, were virtually devoid of non-scientific purpose. 1735. Nevertheless, even purely scientific voyages were intended to enhance the image of the sponsoring nation in an 18th and 19th century equivalent of the Cold War space race. 1819. In this exploratory contest, a new figure emerged, the scientist hero, conquering ignorance on behalf of the nation. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Light, 2022, P11 No Exercise 4. John Barth discusses an Egyptian papyrus complaining that all the stories have been told and that therefore nothing remains for the contemporary writer but to retell them. John Barth. That papyrus describing the postmodern condition is 4,500 years old. 4500. This is not a terrible thing, though. Writers notice all the time that their characters resemble somebody: Persephone, Pip, Long John Silver, La Belle Dame sans merci, and they go with it. Persephone, Pip, Long John Silver, La Belle Dame sans merci. What happens, if the writer is good, is usually not that the work seems derivative or trivial but just the opposite. the work actually acquires depth and resonance from the echoes and chimes it sets up with prior texts, weight from the accumulated use of certain basic patterns and tendencies. Moreover, works are actually more comforting because we recognize elements in them from our prior reading. I suspect that a wholly original work, one that owed nothing to previous writing, would so lack familiarity as to be quite discouraging to readers. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Light, 2022, P11 No Exercise 5. In the period after the Second World War, fat and oil were in short supply, so people collected beech nuts in the woods. 2. These are rare enough most years even without human intervention, and the animals urgently need these calorie bombs for the winter. But during the war, the rural population were ruthless in their desperation. Unwilling to wait for the beech nuts to fall from the trees by themselves, they went around the forest bashing the trunks with mallets. The serious damage to the trees was seen as a necessary consequence. Gathering firewood, especially brushwood which isn't useful for much else, was also common until after the war and caused widespread harm to the forest. Twigs are mostly made up of bark, which means they are particularly nutritious for their size. Deprived of this ground cover of twigs, the forest was starved, leaving nothing for the smallest woodland inhabitants to eat. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Light, 2022, P11 No Exercise 6. All animals have coping mechanisms, including insects. Contrary to popular opinion, a harsh winter has little effect on their population size. Otherwise, most insect species would have long since become extinct. A particularly cold winter is therefore no guarantee that there will be fewer mosquitoes, ticks, or other pests in spring. What is much harder for animals to bear is the cold, wet weather. At temperatures slightly above freezing, rain or mist causes the body temperature to fall quickly. Even for us humans, who can easily wrap up with extra layers of clothing, damp and cold together make for the worst combination. Water conducts heat better than dry air, so the body cools faster. For animals, this means that they consume more energy to maintain the required minimum temperature. And if their fat reserves are depleted too early, before the end of the winter, they're done for. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Light, 2022, P11 No Exercise 7. Examples can be useful, but only to illustrate what you are saying, never to prove it. They should be well chosen for the purpose of making a general statement of your point more intelligible. Many persons have difficulty in dealing with generalizations, especially when these are stated at a high level of abstraction. A concrete example offered to illustrate something stated abstractly helps them to understand what is being said. If you don't understand what others are saying, it is not only proper but also prudent for you to ask them to give you an example of the point. If they cannot do this to your satisfaction, it may be fair to suspect that they themselves do not fully understand what they are trying to say. Examples should be treated like assumptions. Just as assumptions should be allowed to exert whatever force they have only with everyone's explicit acknowledgement and consent, so examples should stand only if everyone sees their relevance and is aware that they are being used to illustrate a point, not to prove it. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Light, 2022, P11 No Exercise 8. Living below a noisy neighbor can be trying, but what generally is the cause of the noise? Most of the irritating noise is described as thuds or thumps and, perhaps surprisingly, is not due to something like high heels clicking on the floor. Rather it is due to low-frequency noise generated by someone walking across the floor. The repeated footfalls cause the floor to oscillate like a drumhead, typically at a frequency between 15 and 35 Hz, which is at the low-frequency end of the audible range for most people. 15-35. Such noise can be heard, and even felt, by the downstairs neighbor. The high-frequency sound of heels clicking on a floor might be heard, but far more energy is transferred to the drum-like, low-frequency floor oscillations. Installing a carpet might actually worsen the situation because, with its softer surface, the footfalls can then transfer even more energy into the floor oscillations. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Light, 2022, P11 No Exercise 911. We lived in farmland and my dad ran a sawmill. My dad got his leg cut off in a farming accident just before I was born. At that time, artificial legs were made out of paper with varnish, they were put around a mold, and there were cables in the ankles that connected the leg to the foot. He was learning to walk again about the same time I was learning to walk. So I grew up with my dad's artificial leg, and things would happen. One time we were delivering mining materials, and there was a timber checker that had to look at every support beam that we were unloading. And these headers weighed anywhere between 200 and 240 pounds apiece. 200240. My dad had to pick every one of those up on the truck and turn it over so the man could see all four edges of it. My dad pulled one of the headers out and got his artificial leg caught, and as he turned, he snapped one of the cables. It let out a pretty loud pop, and he said, "Oh, darn, I think I broke my foot." My dad came walking across the truck, and the foot was turned at right angles to what it should be. And he caught that foot in his two hands, and he straightened it up. It cracked and popped something awful. And that timber checker turned white as cotton. We didn't think anything about it. Several years later, Uncle Lon, my dad's brother, had run into the guy. Lon. He asked Uncle Lon, "Lon, are you any kin to Tom Granger that used to deliver mining materials?" Lon. Lon, Tom Granger. Uncle Lon said, "Sure, that's my little brother." Lon. The timber checker said, "I'll tell you one thing. That's the toughest man I've ever seen. When he broke his foot, he just set that thing and finished unloading that truck." Well, Uncle Lon was laughing so hard, he said tears were rolling down his cheeks. Lon. He never told the guy that it was an artificial leg that my dad was working with. MTC. Good job.